I'd like to start by asking you to introduce yourself, give your name, and talk about your work in linguistic research.
Hi, my name is Bencie Woll. I am a sign linguistics researcher, and I've been working in the field of BSL linguistics for, let's just say, many years, but I won't say exactly how many. I'd like to explain a little bit about the research that I've been involved with in relation to BSL linguistics and the brain.
Okay, so I'd like you to just explain to me more about some other parts of your research. So the question around how does sign language work in the brain? I'm interested to know about that.
Often we learn a lot about how the brain works by looking at people who have some problem with their language, whether it's spoken language for hearing people or sign language for deaf people. So, for example, we know of people who have strokes, and there's a problem where the blood supply doesn't reach certain parts of the brain, which can cause some damage to the brain. People who have a stroke on the left side often have language problems. This is called aphasia, which is a problem producing either words or signs. Or sometimes you can sign but not be understood. And people who have a stroke on the right, their language may be fine, their signs look fine, but they struggle with their facial expressions, and they have a problem producing facial expressions. Often their face will appear blank. But also, people don't understand if a question's being asked because they're not understanding the facial information. And they also may have a problem understanding negation because negation appears on the face. If a negation appears on the hand, it's fine. But if it's on the face only, they don't understand. Some parts of BSL are processed on the left side. Signs, structure of sign language, whereas other parts are processed on the right, such as facial expression. So that helps us understand how language works. At the same time, it means we're able to offer people who have had a stroke, as it were, sign therapy in the same way we do with speech therapy. But it isn't offered at the moment, but it's something that could be offered in the future. We could train people to deliver sign therapy.
So that means the more you know about what happens in the right and left side of the brain, you can identify therapies for people to rehabilitate them, whether that's to do with their use of facial expression or manual signs.
So understanding how the brain works when we offer therapy, so sign therapy to people, means we know what is possible, what things can be improved, what things will be a big challenge for people, and so on. Just the same with speech therapy and speech and language therapy. We could create a training for people to become sign language therapists using the information that we have collected, what the problems are and what improvements can be made. For example, we know that if a person has had a right side stroke, they don't understand facial expressions. So it might be important to improve their communication by making sure that when questions are asked, we add question signs to help understanding. And then we can work on improving the understanding of facial expressions, which would help with communication. You don't want to use negation without using a negating sign at the same time, because that causes problem in understanding. So it's things like that. And things like that can help a person's communication, as well as trying to make things less of a problem.
Right, that's interesting. So it's important to know what happens on the different sides of the brain when someone's signing. Really interesting. And what have the findings from your research been?
Just to say, some of the young people that we looked at were hearing, but they've grown up with sign language. So there were 2 girls with Down syndrome, identical twins. They were both hearing, but their parents were deaf. So they've grown up using sign language at home because their parents signed, but they were both hearing, and they went to a hearing school and they learned English. So we saw children with Down syndrome who knew English and BSL. And it was interesting to look at them because both their English and their BSL had problems. It wasn't that they were amazing signers and they struggled with their English. They had the same problems in both their BSL and their English. But the only thing that they were really good at was gesture. Not language, but they communicated visually really well. But there were problems with language, both BSL and English. Both had similar problems because both are languages. Another example, again, a hearing person. And this person was born without any hearing difficulties, no language problems, and they grew up being able to produce language, but then they developed epilepsy and fits. And that damaged his spoken language. He had no ability to understand spoken language when he was 4. And people thought, he was 4 years old, and people thought that he must have become deaf. So they checked his hearing, and his hearing was normal. He just couldn't understand spoken language, and that was because of the epilepsy. And it had damaged the area that was used for processing spoken language. This boy was sent to a school for hearing children with language problems, but there was no improvement. And he was there from the ages of 5 to 13. And his understanding of spoken language was that of a hearing 2-year-old. When he was 13, the decision was made to send him to a deaf school. And he was in a unit within a deaf school that was for children with additional problems. Remember, he's not deaf, he's hearing. And it was so successful when he was using sign language. So the part of his brain that was damaged wasn't the part of the brain that you need for processing sign language. So it was really lucky that sign language gave him a way to communicate. But it was really late. His learning of sign language was really late. But it was much, much better than his English. So he's grown up now. He has many deaf friends. And at the same time, he loves listening to music as a hearing person. So he lives between both worlds. But without sign language, he wouldn't have communication. So that was really interesting.
That's amazing. So this is someone who's hearing, who can enjoy listening to music, and who's a sign language user as well. So that just shows, I think, the worth and the value of your research.
And it's important because there are very few children who have that condition. And very often they go through life without improving their spoken language. And so BSL can really give them an opportunity to get an education, to learn skills and get a job. And without BSL, they would be stuck. So it is so important.
It really is.
So another person we studied was deaf. I've talked about two hearing people or two hearing studies. And this woman had a very rare syndrome called Williams syndrome, which was different again. And like Down syndrome, there are cognitive problems. But children with Williams syndrome are amazing with language. Hearing children are, with spoken language, and actually better than you'd think. But they have visual spatial problems. They can't draw. They don't process facial expressions well. So when we met this young woman, we were really interested because we were intrigued to know what would happen with a deaf person with this syndrome. Their language should be great, but they would have visual spatial problems, and how would that affect things?
And their balance as well?
Yes. And we wanted to know what would happen if you had visual spatial problems, what would happen with your sign language fluency. When we met her, she loved to sign. She was living in a home for adults with learning difficulties. All of the residents were hearing, and she was teaching everybody how to fingerspell. She was very, very keen, and she really liked communicating. She then moved to live in a home for deaf young adults, which was much better for her. Her sign language was great. She had a lot of signs. Her grammar was good, but she tried to avoid using spatial grammar. So, for example, she wouldn't say the pen is on the table. She would sign it in a different way. She would sign the word on. So she would have ways of getting around that problem. But her signing was good. So she showed no problem with language, but there was a cognition problem because she couldn't think spatially. And so she was signing in a more English way. And so she would get round the spatial problem. And I'll give you one more example. So we did an assessment where we showed her a picture with a house at the side of a crossroads. And the picture was flat on the table, and we asked her to describe it and remember the picture. Remember, I've already said that the picture is flat on the table. And she drew an X in the air in front of her. But it should have been a road, but she's signing an X in the air in front of her. She signed house, and that was fine. And she used a flat hand to the right of her rather than a clawed hand for house. So there was a problem with classifiers there and with space. But she can sign. She did the sign for house, and she could point there, but she couldn't use the classifier we would expect. So she had a problem with the spatial part of language, but her signing wasn't a problem. So she didn't have a problem with the language, but she had a problem with the visual spatial part of the language. So the last group we looked at was something that is quite common, and that is in hearing children. About 7% have developmental language problems. So it's not a problem with cognition, but a problem with learning language. And that is quite common.
So that developmental problem, sorry, what do you mean? Can you give an example? So it's language development that's the problem?
Well, the development is fine, but it's the language that's a problem. So we started by looking at one boy. He's deaf, with deaf parents, so he was used to seeing sign language. But it was his parents who said, there seems to be a problem here with our boy. He doesn't seem to understand things fully. We'll sometimes asking him a question and he will repeat the question back rather than answer it. This boy was 5 when we saw him, and he wasn't producing full sentences in BSL. He would maybe sign one sign, then another. And his parents were thinking there seems to be a problem here. We're using sign all the time. Why is this? And his sister was using sign well. So we started to look at whether this was as common in deaf children as in hearing children. And the answer was yes. We found about 5 to 6% of deaf children who had language learning difficulties. But they're hidden because unless a child has deaf parents who's able to recognise there's a problem, schools might think, or parents might think, oh, it's because the child's deaf. And it's not connected to deafness. The problem is with language learning. And again, for that group, sign therapists are really needed to help improve the situation. But we need to offer the right intervention to help. And if people stop thinking that all problems are because of a child's deafness or because the parents don't sign, it's within the child. And sometimes it's like with dyslexia, where if you speak to the family, you find out that, oh yeah, the father had the same problem, or the mother was very slow at developing spoken language. So sometimes it can be within families. So this research helps us to help teachers to identify and to think about children who are having problems, and to work with deaf people who can work in schools and help with communication, and to try and identify problems and to think about how to work with children.
Do your research findings become part of the training for teachers and for sign language therapists?
So now we're working with deaf teachers and deaf classroom assistants, and we're providing them with suitable training so that they can work better with children in the future.
That's great. So that means that there are more and more people involved in your research, yeah, so a growing number. And that also means that things are improving for people who use BSL and the work you're doing in understanding the brain.
So from our research, there are benefits in 2 ways. In one way, the research helps people who work with deaf children and parents of deaf children, and it offers them more focused help for those deaf children with problems. And the other way is to help those people who have an interest in how the brain works, using examples of problems in sign language that help us understand how the brain works for children in general. This work helps with both theory and practice. And hopefully those two things work hand in hand.
What do you call this field of study? Is it neurology or cognition? What's its name?
So the formal term would be neurobiology of language.
Do you have a sign for that?
Goodness. Well, we use this sign for cognitive and then science of language. It's not only one English word, and therefore there's not just one sign. Maybe in time we'll come up with a shorter version.
Perfect. So brain, sign language. And it does seem that there's more and more interest in this now. So thank you very much. I really appreciate what you've said.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting to have your updates. Thank you.